Picture this scene that's playing out right now across America. It's 3 a.m. in suburban Chicago, and Sarah, a 34-year-old marketing executive, lies wide awake in bed. Her phone glows in the darkness as she scrolls mindlessly through social media, her mind racing with anxiety about tomorrow's presentation, the growing distance in her marriage, and that persistent gnawing feeling that despite all her professional success, her life feels completely hollow and meaningless. Sarah isn't alone. She's one of 50 million Americans currently taking antidepressants, part of a mental health crisis that costs our economy $240 billion annually. Let me help you understand just how staggering these numbers really are. 1 in 5 Americans experiences mental illness each year. Think about that for a moment. In a room of 20 people, 4 are struggling with diagnosed mental health conditions. Suicide rates have increased by 35% since 1999, meaning we're literally watching more Americans die of despair each year. 76% of working Americans report feeling burned out at their jobs, while 61% of young adults describe themselves as seriously lonely. Here's what makes this crisis so bewildering. Despite spending more money on mental health treatment than any nation in history, Americans are more depressed, anxious, and disconnected than ever before. We've built an entire industry around healing psychological pain, yet the pain keeps getting worse. This brings us to what I call the $240 billion question. Why isn't our approach to mental health actually working? The answer lies in a choice we made nearly a century ago, a choice between 2 revolutionary thinkers who saw mental suffering in completely different ways. 2 men, both long dead, predicted exactly the crisis we're living through today. They offered radically different solutions to human psychological pain. One focused on sexual repression and childhood trauma, building his approach around the idea that you must dig endlessly into your past to find healing. The other spoke of meaning, purpose, and what he called the spiritual hunger that defines modern life, arguing that healing comes from discovering who you're meant to become, not just understanding where you came from. One of these approaches became the foundation of modern American therapy. The other was largely ignored by mainstream psychology, dismissed as too mystical, too unscientific. But here's the crucial question we need to answer today. Which approach actually helps people heal nowadays? The stakes of getting this answer right couldn't be higher. Every day, millions of Americans sit in therapy offices, swallow antidepressants, and search desperately for relief from psychological pain that seems to only deepen, despite our best efforts to treat it. The approach we choose will determine whether this crisis gets better or worse, whether the next generation inherits our despair or discovers genuine pathways to healing. To understand how we got into this crisis, we need to travel back to early 20th century Europe, where 2 brilliant minds were developing radically different maps of human psychology. Let me introduce you to Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, and help you understand why the choice between their approaches might be the most important decision facing American mental health today. Imagine you're sitting in Freud's Vienna office in 1920. The walls are lined with ancient artifacts, the air thick with cigar smoke. Freud leans forward and explains your suffering through his revolutionary lens. Your problems, he tells you, stem from repressed sexuality, unresolved conflicts from your earliest childhood, and unconscious drives that you don't even know exist. Your depression isn't really about your meaningless job or failed relationships. It's about unfinished psychological business with your parents from when you were 3 years old. The solution, according to Freud, requires years of careful analysis. You'll lie on his famous couch and free associate, allowing your unconscious mind to reveal its hidden contents. You'll analyze your dreams, explore your sexual fantasies, and uncover the ways your mother and father shaped your psychological destiny. The goal is clear. Make the unconscious conscious, achieve rational control over your irrational impulses, and finally understand why you are the way you are. Now let me take you to Jung's study in Switzerland around the same time. The atmosphere here is different, warmer, filled with art and symbols from cultures around the world. Jung sits across from you, not behind a desk, and offers a completely different understanding of your pain. Your suffering, Jung explains, doesn't primarily come from sexual repression or childhood trauma. Instead, it arises from living a life disconnected from meaning, purpose, and your authentic self. You're not broken or neurotic, You're spiritually starved in a culture that has reduced human existence to material success and surface pleasures. Your depression and anxiety aren't just symptoms to be eliminated. They're signals from your deeper self, trying to tell you that you're living the wrong life for who you truly are. Jung's approach focuses not on endless analysis of your past, but on discovering what he calls your unique path of individuation, the process of becoming fully yourself. Instead of years spent understanding why you're damaged, Jung emphasizes discovering your unrealized potential, connecting with what gives your life meaning, and finding your place in the larger story of human existence. These aren't just different therapeutic techniques, these are fundamentally different philosophies of human nature and healing. Freud sees humans as fundamentally driven by primitive instincts that must be controlled through rational understanding. Jung sees humans as meaning-seeking beings whose suffering often signals their readiness to grow into something greater. Here's the crucial historical fact that explains our current crisis. American psychology chose Freud's path. We built our entire mental health system around the idea that psychological problems are disorders to be diagnosed, unconscious conflicts to be analyzed, and symptoms to be eliminated through understanding their hidden origins. But here's what most people don't realize. While we were building this Freudian system, the evidence was already mounting that Jung's approach produced better results. The few therapists who incorporated Jung's ideas about meaning, purpose, and spiritual development were seeing their clients heal faster and more completely than those using traditional psychoanalytic methods. Let me give you a concrete example of how these different approaches play out in real life. Consider Mark, a 42-year-old accountant struggling with severe depression. A Freudian approach would spend months or years exploring Mark's relationship with his critical father, analyzing dreams about authority figures, and uncovering repressed anger from childhood experiences. A Jungian approach would certainly acknowledge Mark's family history, but would quickly move to more fundamental questions. What is Mark's soul calling him to do with his life? How has he betrayed his authentic nature by choosing security over meaning? What would it look like for Mark to honor his deeper creative or spiritual impulses that he's buried under years of practical concerns? The results speak for themselves. Mark might spend 3 years in psychoanalysis, gaining insight into his father complex. Or he might spend 6 months in Jung-inspired therapy, discovering his calling as a photographer and completely transforming his relationship to work and life. This brings us to the heart of America's mental health crisis. We've been using the wrong map. For nearly a century, we've been trying to heal 21st century spiritual hunger with 19th century theories about sexual repression. We've been treating symptoms of meaninglessness with techniques designed for Victorian neuroses. Let me help you understand the true scope of America's anxiety crisis by breaking down numbers that reveal just how dramatically our current approach is failing. 40 million American adults suffer from anxiety disorders. That's larger than the entire population of California. Anxiety medication prescriptions have tripled since 2000, meaning we're medicating anxiety at rates never seen in human history. College students now report anxiety as their #1 mental health concern, surpassing depression for the first time ever. Perhaps most tragically, what researchers call deaths of despair, suicide, overdose, and alcohol-related deaths are at record highs, primarily driven by anxiety and hopelessness about the future. Now let me walk you through how these two approaches explain and treat this epidemic, so you can see for yourself which framework actually addresses the root causes. Freud's explanation of anxiety reveals the limitations of his entire system. According to classical psychoanalytic theory, anxiety represents repressed sexual energy that has been transformed into irrational fear. Your panic attacks aren't really about your overwhelming work stress or existential dread about the meaninglessness of modern life. They're about unresolved Oedipal complexes, unconscious guilt about sexual desires, or fixation at early developmental stages. The Freudian treatment approach flows directly from this understanding. If anxiety is repressed sexual energy, then the cure involves analyzing your childhood relationships, particularly with your opposite-sex parent, until you understand the unconscious source of your fear. You'll spend sessions exploring early memories, interpreting dreams for sexual symbolism, and working through what Freud saw as the universal human experience of wanting to possess one parent and eliminate the other. But here's the devastating problem with this approach. After nearly a century of psychoanalytic treatment focusing on childhood trauma and sexual repression, anxiety rates have exploded rather than decreased. Patients spend years analyzing their relationships with their parents, while their present-day lives remain anxious, unfulfilling, and directionless. Let me share a real example that illustrates this failure. Jennifer, a 28-year-old teacher, spent 2 years in traditional psychodynamic therapy exploring her anxiety about public speaking. Sessions focused on her relationship with her demanding mother, her unconscious fear of being judged, and childhood experiences of criticism. After 2 years and thousands of dollars, Jennifer had extensive insight into the origins of her anxiety, but still couldn't teach without panic attacks. This pattern repeats millions of times across America, people gaining insight into why they're anxious without developing the tools to actually live differently. Understanding your mother's criticism doesn't automatically give you the courage to pursue meaningful work or authentic relationships. Now let me show you Jung's radically different understanding of anxiety, an understanding that predicted exactly the crisis we're experiencing today. Jung observed that anxiety often functions as what he called a signal from the unconscious, that you're living an inauthentic life, pursuing goals that aren't truly yours, or ignoring your deeper calling. Modern anxiety, Jung argued, frequently stems from what he termed the unlived life, the growing awareness that you're not becoming who you're meant to be. Think about this framework in relation to contemporary American anxiety. Millions of people report feeling anxious about careers that provide financial security, but no personal fulfillment. Others experience panic attacks when contemplating relationships that meet social expectations but don't nourish their souls. Still others feel overwhelmed by the gap between their authentic values and the materialistic culture they're embedded in. Jung would say this anxiety isn't pathological, it's your psyche, is healthy response to living in ways that violate your authentic nature. Your anxiety isn't primarily about your mother or childhood trauma, it's about the urgent need to discover and live according to your true self. The Jungian approach to treating anxiety focuses on what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you authentically are rather than who others expect you to be. Instead of endless analysis of childhood relationships, Jung-inspired therapy helps people discover their genuine values, find work that expresses their unique gifts, and develop what he called their personal myth, a meaningful story about their life's purpose. Let me return to Jennifer's story to show you the difference. When Jennifer worked with a Jung-trained therapist, they spent minimal time analyzing her mother relationship. Instead, they focused on Jennifer's authentic calling as an educator, her genuine passion for helping young people discover their potential, and her need to develop confidence in her unique teaching style rather than trying to conform to conventional educational approaches. The results were dramatic. Within 3 months, Jennifer was teaching with confidence and enthusiasm. Her anxiety didn't disappear entirely, but it transformed from paralyzing panic into what Jung called creative tension, the energizing force that comes from stretching beyond your comfort zone in service of meaningful goals. Studies consistently validate Jung's approach over Freud's for anxiety treatment. Meaning-centered therapies show significantly better outcomes than traditional psychoanalytic approaches. Logotherapy, developed by Jung student Viktor Frankl, produces lasting anxiety reduction in an average of 12 sessions compared to years of traditional analysis. But perhaps most importantly, Jung predicted that anxiety rates would continue climbing in cultures that prioritize material success over meaning, individual achievement over community connection, and rational analysis over spiritual development. Looking at contemporary America, it's clear that Jung understood something about human nature that Freud completely missed. We are meaning-seeking beings, and when we live meaningless lives, anxiety is the inevitable result. The numbers surrounding America's depression epidemic tell a story of therapeutic failure on a massive scale. 21 million Americans experience major depression annually, making it the leading cause of disability in our country. Despite spending billions of dollars on antidepressants and psychotherapy, depression rates continue climbing year after year. Most alarming of all, young people, those who should be most hopeful about the future, report the highest levels of hopelessness in recorded history. These statistics force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Our current approach to understanding and treating depression simply isn't working. Let me walk you through how Freud and Jung viewed depression differently, so you can understand why one approach has failed while the other offers genuine hope. Freud's framework for understanding depression reveals both his theoretical brilliance and his practical limitations. According to psychoanalytic theory, depression represents anger turned inward. Rage that you can't express outwardly gets redirected against yourself, creating the self-attacking thoughts and hopeless feelings that characterize depressive episodes. This anger, Freud believed, typically stems from unresolved grief over early losses, repressed hostility toward parents who disappointed or wounded you, or what he called fixation at early developmental stages where your emotional growth became stuck. The depressed person is essentially trapped in childhood emotional patterns, unconsciously punishing themselves for feelings they couldn't safely express as children. The psychoanalytic treatment for depression flows logically from this understanding. You'll spend sessions uncovering these unconscious conflicts through free association and dream analysis, gradually bringing repressed anger into conscious awareness. The theory suggests that once you understand why you're angry and can express these feelings safely in therapy, the depression will lift. But here's where we encounter the devastating real-world failure of this approach. Traditional psychodynamic therapy for depression shows modest results at best, and many patients actually become worse during treatment. They develop what therapists call analysis paralysis, becoming so focused on understanding their problems that they lose the capacity to take positive action in their current lives. Let me share Maria's story to illustrate this pattern. Maria, a 35-year-old nurse, spent 3 years in psychoanalytic therapy for depression. Sessions focused extensively on her relationship with her alcoholic father, her mother's emotional unavailability, and the ways these early experiences shaped her adult relationships. After 3 years of twice-weekly sessions, Maria had profound insight into her family dynamics, but remained just as depressed, now with the added burden of feeling that her depression was her fault for not working through her issues effectively. This represents the core problem with Freud's approach to depression. It assumes that understanding the past automatically creates the ability to live differently in the present. But insight alone rarely produces transformation, and extensive focus on psychological problems often reinforces the very patterns it's meant to heal. Now let me introduce you to Jung's revolutionary understanding of depression, an understanding that reframes the entire experience in ways that actually promote healing. Jung observed that depression often signals what he called the death of an outdated life structure. Instead of viewing depression primarily as pathology, Jung recognized it as what he termed the nigredo, an alchemical concept referring to the dark night of the soul that precedes psychological rebirth. From this perspective, depression isn't just something wrong with you. It's often your psyche's way of breaking down patterns that no longer serve your growth. Think about how this reframes the depression experience. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" Jung encouraged asking, "What is trying to be born in my life? What old ways of being need to die so that something new can emerge?" This understanding explains why depression often coincides with major life transitions, career changes, relationship endings, spiritual awakening, or the recognition that you've been living according to others' expectations rather than your authentic nature. Your depression might be your soul's rebellion against a life that doesn't honor who you're becoming. Jung's approach to treating depression focuses on what he called prospective, rather than reductive, analysis. Instead of reducing your current suffering to past causes, Jung emphasized discovering what your depression is calling you toward. What new life wants to be born? What authentic aspects of yourself have been buried under social expectations? What would it look like to honor your deeper nature? Let me return to Maria's story to show you the difference. When Maria began working with a Jung-inspired therapist, they acknowledged her family history, but quickly moved to more fundamental questions. What was Maria's authentic calling beyond the nursing career she'd chosen to please her family? How had she abandoned her artistic gifts in favor of practical security? What would it look like for Maria to create a life that honored both her need to help others and her creative nature? Within 6 months, Maria had begun painting again, started volunteering with art therapy programs, and was exploring ways to combine her medical training with creative healing approaches. Her depression didn't disappear overnight, but it transformed from hopeless stagnation into what Jung called creative tension, the productive discomfort that comes from growing into your fuller self. The evidence supporting Jung's approach over Freud's is overwhelming. Logotherapy, developed by Jung's student Viktor Frankl, based on Jung's insights about meaning and purpose, shows superior results to traditional psychoanalysis for treating depression. Studies demonstrate that meaning-centered therapy produces lasting change in 8 to 12 sessions, compared to years of traditional analysis with modest results. Perhaps most importantly, Jung understood something about human nature that explains why depression rates continue climbing. Despite increased access to mental health treatment, humans are not just pleasure-seeking or even problem-solving beings. We are meaning-creating beings, and when our lives lack genuine purpose and authentic self-expression, depression is often the inevitable result. This insight has profound implications for how we approach the depression epidemic. Instead of focusing primarily on past trauma or neurochemical imbalances, Jung's framework suggests we need to help people discover their authentic purpose, express their genuine nature, and create lives aligned with their deepest values. These statistics surrounding relationships in modern America read like a civilization in collapse. 50% of marriages end in divorce, and the average duration of romantic relationships continues decreasing each year. 28% of men under 30 report not having had sex in the past year, while dating apps have created what researchers call the paradox of choice, leading to widespread commitment phobia and serial dating rather than meaningful partnership formation. Perhaps most disturbing of all, young people, those who should be forming the deepest bonds of their lives, report being lonelier than senior citizens. We're witnessing what sociologists call the relationship apocalypse, and understanding how we got here requires examining the fundamental assumptions about human intimacy that have guided American culture for the past century. Let me walk you through how Freud's sexual obsession shaped our approach to relationships, why this focus has backfired spectacularly, and how Jung's deeper understanding of human connection offers a path toward genuine intimacy in the 21st century. Freud's approach to relationships was revolutionary for his time, but has proven catastrophically inadequate for ours. According to psychoanalytic theory, all relationship problems ultimately stem from what Freud called psychosexual issues: repressed sexual desires, unresolved attraction to parents, the famous Oedipal and Electra complexes, or fixation at early developmental stages that prevents mature sexual expression. From this perspective, if you're having relationship difficulties, the root cause lies in sexual dysfunction, unconscious competition with same-sex parents, or the inability to separate psychologically from your family of origin. The solution involves analyzing these unconscious sexual and aggressive drives until you can express them in healthier ways with adult partners. This framework profoundly influenced American culture's approach to relationships. The sexual revolution of the 1960s, heavily influenced by Freudian ideas about sexual repression, promised that liberating our sexual expression would cure relationship problems and create more fulfilling, intimate connections. We were told that traditional moral constraints on sexuality were neurotic remnants of Victorian repression, and that healthy people should embrace sexual freedom without guilt or reservation. But here's the devastating reality. Instead of creating healthier relationships, this sexual liberation has produced new forms of dysfunction that would have been unimaginable in Freud's era. Pornography addiction now affects millions of men, fundamentally altering their capacity for intimate connection. Hookup culture has created what psychologists call sexual scripts that prioritize performance over genuine emotional connection. Dating apps have gamified romance, reducing potential partners to a series of superficial choices based primarily on physical appearance. Most tragically, the reduction of intimate relationships to sexual dynamics has left millions of people capable of physical intimacy but incapable of the emotional vulnerability that creates lasting bonds. We've learned how to have sex but forgotten how to fall in love, how to commit, how to build the deep partnerships that sustain human flourishing. Let me share David's story to illustrate how Freud's framework fails modern relationships. David, a 32-year-old software engineer, sought therapy because he couldn't maintain romantic relationships beyond a few months. His psychodynamic therapist focused extensively on David's relationship with his mother, exploring how his unconscious desire for maternal approval affected his choice of partners and his sexual performance. After 18 months of analysis, David had extensive insight into his mother complex, but remained just as unable to commit to relationships. He understood intellectually why he was attracted to nurturing women, but then felt suffocated by their care. But this understanding didn't translate into the capacity to create different relationship patterns. Now let me introduce you to Jung's radically different understanding of intimate relationships, an understanding that addresses the root causes of our relationship crisis rather than its superficial symptoms. Jung recognized that healthy relationships require what he called psychological differentiation, the development of two complete individuals who choose to create something greater than themselves together. Most relationship problems, Jung observed, didn't stem primarily from sexual dysfunction, but from what he called unconscious projections, the tendency to see in your partner qualities that you haven't developed in yourself. For example, if you haven't developed your own capacity for emotional expression, you might be attracted to highly emotional partners who can carry that energy for you. But eventually, you'll resent them for the very quality you initially found attractive, because their emotionality will remind you of your own underdeveloped capacity for feeling. Jung's concept of shadow work offers profound insights into relationship difficulties. The shadow represents those aspects of yourself that you've denied, repressed, or disowned. In relationships, we often unconsciously choose partners who will carry our shadow projections, all the anger, neediness, creativity, or spirituality that we can't accept in ourselves. This creates what Jung called unconscious contracts in relationships. I'll be the responsible one if you'll be the spontaneous one. I'll handle all the emotions if you'll handle all the practical concerns. I'll be the spiritual one if you'll be the worldly one. These arrangements work temporarily, but eventually create resentment and conflict, as both partners feel constrained by their assigned roles. Jung's approach to relationship healing emphasizes individual wholeness before partnership. Instead of focusing primarily on sexual dynamics or communication skills, Jung-inspired relationship work helps each partner reclaim their projected qualities and develop the capacity to be complete individuals within the relationship. Let me return to David's story to show you the difference. When David worked with a Jung-trained therapist, they quickly moved beyond analyzing his mother relationship to more fundamental questions. What qualities was David projecting onto his romantic partners? How had he made women responsible for his emotional life while he remained disconnected from his feelings? What would it look like for David to develop his own capacity for nurturing and emotional expression? As David began doing this inner work, his relationship patterns transformed dramatically. Instead of being attracted to women who would take care of his emotional needs, he began seeking partners who shared his values and life vision. Instead of fleeing when relationships became intimate, he developed the capacity to be vulnerable while maintaining his individual identity. The evidence supporting Jung's approach over Freud's is compelling. The most successful relationship therapies today, including emotionally focused therapy and the Gottman method, incorporate Jung-inspired concepts of differentiation, shadow integration, and meaning-making, rather than focusing primarily on sexual dynamics or childhood analysis. Modern research validates Jung's emphasis on individual wholeness as the foundation for healthy partnership. Studies consistently show that the strongest relationships involve two people who have developed secure individual identities and can maintain their authentic selves within intimate connection. Perhaps most importantly, Jung understood that the relationship crisis in modern culture stems from spiritual and psychological poverty, rather than sexual repression. When people lack connection to meaning, purpose, and their authentic selves, they inevitably seek partners to fill these voids, rather than creating genuine partnerships between whole individuals. The American workplace has become a psychological wasteland that would have shocked even the most pessimistic social critics of previous generations. 85% of people report being disengaged at work, describing their jobs as sources of stress, boredom, and existential emptiness rather than fulfillment or purpose. Quiet quitting, doing the absolute minimum required to avoid being fired, has become a cultural phenomenon affecting millions of workers who have given up on finding meaning in their professional lives. Burnout rates have reached epidemic proportions across all industries, while the Great Resignation reflects millions of Americans walking away from financially secure positions in desperate searches for work that connects to their deeper values and authentic interests. Despite material prosperity that would have been unimaginable to previous generations, career satisfaction continues plummeting, leaving millions of people spending the majority of their waking hours in activities that drain their souls rather than nourish them. Understanding how we created this career crisis requires examining the psychological frameworks that have shaped how Americans think about work, success, and professional fulfillment over the past century. Freud's approach to career and work life reveals the limitations of reducing human complexity to unconscious sexual and aggressive drives. According to psychoanalytic theory, career choices represent what Freud called sublimation, the transformation of primitive sexual and aggressive energies into socially acceptable activities. Your choice to become a teacher, lawyer, artist, or business owner is understood primarily as an expression of unconscious conflicts, usually stemming from unresolved relationships with your parents. From this perspective, if you chose a helping profession like nursing or social work, you're unconsciously trying to repair your relationship with a mother who didn't adequately care for you. If you pursued a competitive field like law or business, you're working out aggressive impulses that you couldn't safely express in childhood. If you became an artist or writer, you're sublimating sexual energy into creative expression. The Freudian approach to career counseling and workplace psychology focuses heavily on understanding these unconscious motivations. Traditional career therapy analyzes your family dynamics, explores your childhood fantasies about adult roles, and attempts to uncover the hidden psychological meanings behind your professional choices. But here's the fundamental problem with this approach. Understanding why you unconsciously chose your career doesn't help you find fulfilling work. Spending months analyzing your father complex might explain why you became a lawyer to win his approval, but it doesn't guide you toward work that actually engages your authentic talents and serves your soul as development. Let me share Patricia's story to illustrate this limitation. Patricia, a 43-year-old accountant, spent 2 years in psychodynamic therapy exploring her career dissatisfaction. Sessions focused extensively on her relationship with her critical father, her unconscious need to prove her worth through financial success, and the ways her career choice represented rebellion against her mother's creative but impractical nature. After 2 years of analysis, Patricia had profound insight into the unconscious motivations behind her career path, but she remained just as miserable in her accounting job. Understanding that she had chosen financial work to gain her father's approval didn't automatically reveal what kind of work would actually fulfill her authentic nature. Now let me introduce you to Jung's revolutionary approach to career and vocation, an approach that has inspired the most effective career development strategies of the 21st century. Jung believed that your career should serve what he called your individuation process, the lifelong journey of becoming fully yourself and expressing your unique gifts in service to both personal development and collective healing. Rather than reducing career choices to unconscious parental conflicts, Jung emphasized the concept of vocation, literally meaning calling, suggesting that meaningful work emerges from listening to your deeper nature, rather than analyzing your unconscious pathology. Jung developed several frameworks that revolutionize how we approach career development. His psychological type theory, the foundation for modern personality assessments like Myers-Briggs, helps people identify work environments and roles that align with their natural strengths and energy patterns. His understanding of what he called the transcendent function suggests that fulfilling work serves both individual growth and collective transformation. Most importantly, Jung recognized that career transitions and workplace dissatisfaction often signal what he called developmental crises. Moments when your soul is calling you toward greater authenticity and fuller expression of your potential. Instead of viewing career struggles as problems to be solved through understanding their unconscious origins, Jung saw them as opportunities for psychological and spiritual growth. Jung's approach to career development emphasizes several key principles that directly address the modern workplace crisis. First, he believed that understanding your psychological type helps you identify work environments where you can thrive, rather than merely survive. Introverts need different professional structures than extroverts. Thinking types flourish in different roles than feeling types, and sensing types require different kinds of stimulation than intuitive types. Second, Jung emphasized the importance of what he called shadow work in career development. Often we choose careers that allow us to express only parts of our personality while repressing other aspects. The shadow in career terms includes all the talents, interests, and values that you've abandoned in favor of practical or socially acceptable choices. Third, Jung understood that meaningful work connects individual development to what he called collective healing, contributing to the greater good through expressing your authentic gifts. This framework explains why so many Americans feel unfulfilled despite financial success. They're earning money, but not serving their deeper purpose or contributing meaningfully to human flourishing. Let me return to Patricia's story to show you how Jung's approach creates different results. When Patricia worked with a Jung-inspired career counselor, they spent minimal time analyzing her family dynamics. Instead, they focused on identifying Patricia's authentic psychological type. She discovered she was a highly intuitive, feeling-oriented person trapped in a thinking-type profession, exploring the creative and helping impulses she had abandoned for financial security, and developing a transition plan toward work that honored both her practical needs and her authentic nature. Within 18 months, Patricia had transitioned from accounting to financial counseling for non-profit organizations, combining her analytical skills with her natural capacity for helping others and her values around social justice. Her work became a source of energy rather than depletion, and she reported feeling like she was finally using her life in service of something meaningful. The evidence supporting Jung's approach over Freud's is overwhelming. Modern career development strategies that incorporate Jung-inspired principles, including strengths-based coaching, values-driven career counseling, and meaning-centered professional development, show dramatically better results than traditional psychodynamic career therapy. Studies consistently demonstrate that people who align their work with their authentic psychological type, core values, and sense of purpose report higher job satisfaction, better performance, and greater resilience in the face of workplace challenges. Organizations that help employees discover and express their authentic talents show lower turnover rates, higher productivity, and better overall morale. Perhaps most importantly, Jung understood that the career crisis in modern culture stems from the reduction of work to mere economic activity, rather than recognizing it as a crucial component of psychological and spiritual development. When people view work only as a means to earn money, rather than as an opportunity to express their authentic nature and serve collective healing, career dissatisfaction is inevitable. The numbers surrounding America's addiction crisis reveal a system in complete failure. 21 million Americans struggle with substance addiction, while 18 million abuse prescription drugs, often obtained through legitimate medical channels. But substance addiction represents only the visible tip of a much larger iceberg of behavioral addictions that are reshaping American consciousness. Social media addiction, pornography compulsion, compulsive shopping, gambling, and what researchers now recognize as digital dependence, affecting millions of people who cannot function without constant technological stimulation. Perhaps most tragically, traditional addiction treatment maintains a 90% relapse rate, meaning that 9 out of 10 people who complete conventional addiction programs return to their addictive behaviors within a year. Meanwhile, deaths of despair from addiction-related causes have reached epidemic proportions, primarily among Americans who have lost hope that their lives can ever become meaningful or fulfilling. These statistics force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Our current approach to understanding and treating addiction is fundamentally inadequate. The medical model that views addiction as a brain disease requiring pharmaceutical intervention has failed spectacularly, while psychoanalytic approaches that focus on unconscious childhood conflicts have produced equally disappointing results. But there's a remarkable exception to this pattern of failure, an exception that reveals exactly what we've been missing in our approach to addiction recovery. Let me walk you through how Freud and Jung understood addiction differently and show you why one approach has failed, while the other has created the only genuinely successful addiction recovery programs in human history. Freud's theory of addiction flows logically from his broader understanding of human psychology as driven by unconscious sexual and aggressive impulses. According to psychoanalytic theory, addiction represents what Freud called fixation at the oral stage of development, a return to the infant's need for oral stimulation and immediate gratification when faced with adult stresses that overwhelm the ego's capacity to cope. From this perspective, addiction is essentially a form of psychological regression to childhood patterns of soothing and self-regulation. The alcoholic returns to the bottle because drinking recreates the comfort of nursing at mother's breast. The drug user seeks chemicals that provide the immediate pleasure and relief from anxiety that characterize the earliest relationship between infant and caregiver. Freudian addiction treatment focuses heavily on uncovering the unconscious meanings behind addictive behavior. Traditional psychodynamic addiction therapy analyzes your relationship with your parents, explores childhood experiences of deprivation or trauma, and attempts to understand how addiction serves unconscious psychological functions like self-punishment, rebellion against authority, or desperate attempts to fill emotional voids created by early wounds. The theory suggests that once you understand these unconscious motivations and work through the childhood conflicts that addiction represents, you'll develop healthier ways to meet your emotional needs and won't require substances or behaviors to regulate your psychological state. But here's the devastating reality. Decades of psychoanalytically oriented addiction treatment have produced dismal results. Patients spend years analyzing why they drink, use drugs, or engage in compulsive behaviors, but this understanding rarely translates into sustained recovery. Many people can articulate sophisticated psychological theories about their addiction while remaining completely unable to stop their destructive behaviors. Let me share Michael's story to illustrate this pattern. Michael, a 38-year-old attorney, spent 4 years in psychodynamic therapy for alcohol addiction. Sessions focused extensively on his relationship with his emotionally distant father, his mother's depression and prescription drug use, and the ways alcohol helped him manage anxiety about professional performance and intimacy in relationships. After 4 years of twice-weekly sessions and multiple relapses, Michael had extensive insight into the psychological functions his drinking served, but he remained unable to maintain sobriety for longer than a few weeks at a time. Understanding that he drank to numb feelings of inadequacy and abandonment didn't provide him with the spiritual resources necessary to live differently. This represents the core limitation of Freud's approach to addiction. It assumes that insight into unconscious motivations automatically creates the capacity for behavioral change. But addiction operates at levels of human experience that purely psychological analysis cannot reach, levels that Jung understood with remarkable clarity. Now let me introduce you to Jung's revolutionary understanding of addiction, an understanding that has created the only genuinely successful recovery programs in modern history. In 1961, Jung wrote a famous letter to Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, that fundamentally reframed how we understand addictive behavior. Jung explained that addiction represents what he called the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness being expressed at what he termed a low level. According to Jung, the craving for alcohol or drugs isn't primarily about psychological regression or unconscious conflict. It's a misdirected spiritual hunger, a desperate attempt to experience transcendence, connection, and meaning through substances that can temporarily provide these experiences, but can never satisfy the deeper longing that drives them. Jung wrote to Bill Wilson, "You see, alcohol in Latin is spiritus, and you use the same word for the highest religious experience as well as for the most depraving poison. The helpful formula, therefore, is spiritus contra spiritum, spirit against spirit." In other words, addiction to chemical spirits can only be overcome by connection to spiritual reality. This insight transformed everything about how we understand and treat addictive behavior. Instead of viewing addiction as pathology to be analyzed, Jung saw it as misdirected religious impulse, the soul's attempt to experience what he called the numinous, the divine or transcendent, through substances that provide temporary glimpses of expanded consciousness, but ultimately lead to destruction, rather than genuine spiritual development. Jung's framework explains why addiction rates are highest in cultures that have lost connection to transcendent meaning and spiritual community. When people have no access to genuine religious experience, they seek chemically induced states that temporarily provide what the soul craves: connection, transcendence, relief from the isolation of purely material existence. This understanding led directly to the development of the 12-step program, which incorporates Jung's insights about addiction as spiritual crisis requiring spiritual solution. The 12 steps focus not on analyzing unconscious conflicts, but on developing what Jung called vital spiritual experience, direct connection to what the program terms a higher power and purpose beyond the self. Let me walk you through how Jung's approach creates dramatically different results. The 12-step program begins with what Jung would recognize as ego deflation, admitting powerlessness over addiction and acknowledging that willpower and rational understanding alone cannot create recovery. This represents a fundamental departure from Freudian emphasis on strengthening ego control through insight. Steps 2 and 3 involve what Jung called surrender to the self, opening to guidance from what 12-step programs call a higher power, but which Jung understood as the archetypal source of wisdom and healing within the collective unconscious. This spiritual surrender creates what Jung termed a religious conversion experience that provides the foundation for sustained behavioral change. The middle steps focus on what Jung would recognize as shadow work, taking honest inventory of character defects, making amends for past harms, and taking responsibility for the ways addiction has damaged relationships and integrity. This process integrates the disowned aspects of personality that fuel addictive behavior. The final steps emphasize what Jung called the transcendent function, using your recovery experience to help others struggling with similar problems. This transforms what Jung termed the wounded healer archetype, allowing people to find meaning and purpose through serving others who are suffering in similar ways. Let me return to Michael's story to show you the difference Jung's approach creates. When Michael began attending AA meetings and working the 12 steps, the focus shifted completely away from analyzing his family dynamics. Instead, he began developing daily spiritual practices, connecting with a community of people committed to spiritual growth and finding ways to serve others struggling with addiction. Within 18 months, Michael had maintained continuous sobriety while developing what he described as a completely different relationship to life. Instead of using alcohol to escape anxiety and depression, he was using meditation, prayer, and service to others to create the sense of connection and purpose that his soul had been seeking through drinking. The evidence supporting Jung's approach over Freud's is overwhelming. 12-step programs, based directly on Jung's insights about addiction as spiritual crisis, have success rates dramatically higher than any other addiction treatment approach. Studies show that people who develop spiritual practices and meaning-centered living have the strongest predictors of sustained recovery. Perhaps most importantly, Jung understood that addiction represents what he called a sacred disease, a spiritual crisis that, when properly understood and addressed, can become a pathway to profound psychological and spiritual development. Many people in long-term recovery report that their addiction ultimately served their individuation process by forcing them to confront the emptiness of purely materialistic living and develop genuine connection to transcendent values. We've now examined how Freud's and Jung's approaches apply to every major mental health crisis facing contemporary America: anxiety, depression, relationship breakdown, career meaninglessness, and addiction. In every single category, we've seen the same pattern: Freudian-based approaches that focus on pathology, childhood analysis, and sexual drives have failed to stem these epidemics, while Jung-inspired approaches that emphasize meaning, purpose, and spiritual development show dramatically better results. This raises the crucial question: why did America choose the path that has led us to our current mental health crisis? Understanding this choice and its devastating consequences is essential for charting a different course toward genuine healing. American psychology embraced Freud's approach for reasons that had less to do with therapeutic effectiveness and more to do with cultural and economic forces that shaped the development of mental health treatment in the 20th century. First, Freud's medical model promised to make psychology scientific in ways that could be measured, standardized, and taught in university settings. Jung's emphasis on meaning, spirituality, and individual uniqueness was difficult to quantify and didn't fit the increasingly scientific orientation of American medicine and academia. Second, Freud's approach was more compatible with insurance-based healthcare systems. Psychiatric diagnoses based on symptom clusters could be coded, billed, and reimbursed in ways that Jung's individualized approach to psychological development could not. The emphasis on pathology and disorder created a medical framework that insurance companies could understand and reimburse. Third, Freud's reductionist approach fit better with American materialism and rational skepticism. Jung's concepts of collective unconscious, archetypal patterns, and spiritual development seemed too mystical for a culture that prided itself on scientific rationalism and practical effectiveness. But the cost of this choice has been catastrophic. By building our entire mental health system around Freud's pathology-focused, childhood-obsessed, sexually reductionist framework, we've created a treatment approach that focuses on what's wrong rather than what's possible. Patients spend years analyzing their problems rather than developing their potential. Mental health treatment becomes a process of managing symptoms rather than promoting flourishing, creates dependence rather than empowerment. Traditional psychoanalysis can last for years or decades, with patients becoming dependent on therapists to interpret their experiences, rather than developing their own capacity for self-understanding and growth. Reduces human complexity to unconscious sexual and aggressive drives. The rich spiritual, creative, and meaning-seeking dimensions of human nature are either ignored or explained away as sublimated sexuality or disguised aggression. Treat symptoms while ignoring root causes. By focusing on childhood trauma and unconscious conflicts, Freudian approaches often miss the existential and spiritual dimensions of psychological suffering that Jung recognized as primary. Marginalizes the role of meaning, purpose, and spiritual development in mental health. Despite overwhelming evidence that people with strong spiritual practices and sense of purpose have better mental health outcomes, these factors are largely ignored in conventional treatment. Now let me show you what Jung's alternative approach offers for transforming American mental health care. An approach that addresses root causes rather than symptoms, empowers individuals rather than creating dependence, and treats human beings as meaning-seeking spirits rather than just biological machines driven by unconscious impulses. Instead of endless analysis of the past, Jung emphasized what he called prospective therapy, focusing on purposeful creation of the future. Jung-inspired treatment helps people discover their authentic calling and develop their unrealized potential rather than endlessly dissecting childhood wounds that may or may not be relevant to current struggles. Instead of viewing symptoms as pathology, Jung recognized them as what he called growth signals from the unconscious. Anxiety, depression, and life crises often indicate that old patterns are breaking down to make room for new development. This reframes psychological suffering as potentially meaningful rather than purely pathological. Instead of reducing everything to sexual or aggressive drives, Jung honored what he called the spiritual dimension of human suffering. Many psychological problems stem from what Jung termed spiritual poverty in materialistic cultures that provide no access to transcendent meaning or genuine community. Instead of creating patient dependence on therapist interpretation, Jung emphasized developing relationship with what he called the self, the inner guidance system that promotes psychological wholeness and authentic development. Jung-inspired therapy aims to help people become their own healers rather than permanent patients. Jung's approach has already inspired the most effective therapeutic innovations of the 21st century, though most people don't realize their Jungian origins. Logotherapy, developed by Jung student Viktor Frankl, focuses on helping people discover meaning in their suffering and develop sense of purpose. Studies show it's more effective than psychoanalysis for depression, anxiety, and existential crises, typically producing results in 12 to 20 sessions rather than years of treatment. Archetypal psychology uses Jung's understanding of universal psychological patterns to help people understand their life stories through mythic and symbolic frameworks, providing profound healing and direction without endless analysis of personal history. Active imagination, Jung's technique of consciously engaging with unconscious material through imagery and dialogue, provides rapid access to inner wisdom and creative solutions without requiring years of dependency on therapeutic interpretation. Shadow work helps people integrate disowned aspects of personality, preventing psychological projection, reducing interpersonal conflict, and increasing self-acceptance through understanding rather than analysis. Psychological type work, based on Jung's personality theory, helps people understand their natural strengths and find careers, relationships, and lifestyles aligned with their authentic nature rather than social expectations. Jung-inspired therapies consistently outperform traditional psychoanalytic approaches across multiple measures. Efficiency. Most Jung-inspired approaches produce significant results in 12 to 20 sessions versus years of traditional analysis. Empowerment. Clients develop internal resources and self-understanding rather than dependence on therapist interpretation. Holistic results. Treatment addresses spiritual and meaning-based dimensions of healing rather than focusing only on symptom reduction. Prevention. By helping people develop authentic life direction and spiritual resources, Jung-inspired approaches prevent many problems rather than just treating existing symptoms. Life satisfaction. People report higher levels of purpose, creativity, and genuine fulfillment rather than just symptom management. As we reach the end of this exploration, we arrive at a moment of profound choice, not just for individuals seeking healing, but for American culture as a whole. The evidence is overwhelming. Our current mental health approach, built on Freudian foundations, has failed to address the psychological and spiritual crisis facing our society. Despite spending more money on mental health treatment than any civilization in history, Americans are more depressed, anxious, addicted, and disconnected than ever before. This isn't a failure of effort or resources, it's a failure of understanding. We've been trying to heal 21st century spiritual hunger with 19th century theories about sexual repression. We've been treating symptoms of meaninglessness with techniques designed for Victorian neuroses. We've been pathologizing the natural human need for purpose, transcendence, and authentic self-expression. The Freudian path. Continue investing billions of dollars in therapeutic approaches that focus on pathology rather than potential, create dependence rather than empowerment. Reduce human complexity to unconscious sexual and aggressive drives, and view psychological crises as disorders to be managed rather than growth opportunities to be embraced. This path leads exactly where it has led us, escalating rates of anxiety, depression, addiction, and despair despite unprecedented access to mental health treatment. It creates a society of permanent patients rather than empowered individuals, a culture that understands dysfunction better than it understands flourishing. The Jungian alternative. Embrace therapeutic approaches that honor human potential rather than focusing primarily on pathology. Emphasize meaning and purpose as essential elements of psychological health. Integrate spiritual dimensions of healing that materialism cannot provide. Empower individuals to develop their own inner resources rather than creating dependence on professional interpreters, and view psychological crises as opportunities for transformation and growth rather than just problems to be solved. This path offers genuine hope for healing not just individual suffering, but the collective crisis that defines our historical moment. Every day that we delay this transformation, more Americans sink into depression that conventional treatment cannot touch. More young people develop anxiety disorders that medication cannot cure. More families are destroyed by addiction that psychoanalytic insight cannot heal. More people spend their lives in careers that drain their souls, while therapists help them understand why they chose meaningless work rather than helping them discover meaningful alternatives. But perhaps most tragically, every day, we continue following Freudian approaches. We reinforce the very worldview that created our mental health crisis. The belief that humans are nothing more than biological machines driven by unconscious impulses, that spiritual needs are just disguised sexuality, that meaning and purpose are luxuries rather than necessities for psychological health. Jung's vision offers something our culture desperately needs, a psychology that recognizes humans as meaning-creating beings, whose suffering often signals their readiness to grow into something greater, a therapeutic approach that helps people discover their authentic calling, rather than endlessly analyzing why they're broken, a framework that honors the spiritual dimensions of healing while remaining grounded in practical effectiveness. Most importantly, Jung's approach offers the possibility of transforming our entire culture's relationship to psychological suffering. Instead of viewing mental health crises as evidence of individual pathology, we can recognize them as symptoms of a society that has lost connection to transcendent meaning and authentic community. If you're someone who has struggled with anxiety, depression, relationship problems, career dissatisfaction, or addictive behaviors, the choice between Freudian and Jungian approaches isn't academic, it's potentially life-changing. You can continue seeking therapists who will help you understand why you're the way you are, or you can find practitioners who will help you discover who you're meant to become. You can spend years analyzing your childhood wounds, or you can invest that time and energy in developing your unrealized potential. You can view your psychological struggles as evidence that something is wrong with you, or you can recognize them as signals that you're ready to grow beyond your current life structure. But individual healing alone cannot address the collective crisis we're facing. We need what Jung would have recognized as cultural transformation, a fundamental shift in how American society understands human nature, psychological health, and the conditions necessary for human flourishing. This transformation requires recognizing that our mental health crisis isn't primarily about individual brain chemistry or childhood trauma. It's about living in a culture that provides no access to genuine meaning, authentic community, or transcendent purpose. Until we address these collective spiritual needs, individual therapeutic interventions will continue producing modest results at best. The evidence is overwhelming. The results speak for themselves. Jung's approach to understanding and healing human psychological suffering offers everything that Freud's approach lacks: efficiency instead of endless analysis, empowerment instead of dependence, hope instead of pathology-focused despair, spiritual nourishment instead of reductive materialism. The question isn't whether Jung's insights are valid. Decades of research and clinical experience have validated his core understanding of human nature and healing. The question is whether American culture has the courage to abandon failed approaches and embrace therapeutic frameworks that actually work. This isn't just about choosing different therapeutic techniques. It's about choosing a different vision of human nature and possibility. It's about deciding whether Americans will continue being defined by their psychological problems or empowered to discover their authentic potential. The choice is ours. The time is now. And for the millions of Americans struggling with anxiety, depression, meaninglessness, and despair, the stakes could not be higher. Jung's revolutionary understanding of human psychology offers us a path toward genuine healing, not just for individual suffering, but for the collective spiritual crisis that defines our historical moment. The only question remaining is whether we'll have the wisdom and courage to choose the path that leads to life, rather than continuing down the road that has brought us to this point of crisis. The future of American mental health, and perhaps American culture itself, depends on the choice we make.